Batman and Robin.
From the early 70s to the late 1980s, superhero media was still in its early stages. During this time, many comic book adaptations were mostly relegated to low-budget TV shows, TV movies, or straight-to-DVD features with varying degrees of quality. Most of these adaptations at the time were fantastical and campy in nature. They didn't exactly take themselves too seriously, so they were mostly passed off as kids' entertainment. Occasionally, we would receive some theatrical comic book films like Christopher Reeve's Superman movies, Tim Burton's Batman, that one terrible Supergirl film from 1984, and Howard the Duck.
I have developed a greater appreciation for the female version of the human anatomy.
Oh, Howard, you really are the worst.
Just like all the other comic book adaptations before them, all these films embraced the fantastical and campy natures of their source material. That was until 1989, where the world saw the release of The Punisher, a film based off a Marvel anti-hero that opened to average and poor reviews. However, what made this film special from all other superhero movies at the time is that it felt less like a superhero movie and more like a 90s action flick, devoid of anything to signify its comic roots.
What the fuck do you call 125 murders in 5 years, huh?
Work in progress.
Over the course of the next couple of years, we'd see the release of more and more dark superhero movies with varying degrees of quality and box office draw. Now, what do all these films share in common? Well, most of these films are based off dark source materials, and thus, they all share an R rating. Now, you might think that's not special nowadays, as we live in a time where R-rated superhero movies are basically the norm. But we have to remember that from the late 80s to the late 2000s, R-rated superhero flicks were few and far between, and nowhere near as profitable as they are now. However, that led me to a realization. What is the actual purpose of mature superhero films, specifically those of the R-rated variety?
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
It's important to make one thing clear. Comic books at their inception were created for kids. Specifically, kids around the ages of 8 to 14 years old. They were larger-than-life stories that captured grandiose tales with unique, colorful, and quirky characters. Although yes, some characters and stories were darker than others, they were still aimed at a young audience. Now, before some of you decide to leave a nasty comment like,
"I kindly disagree, sir. Comics were created for a mature audience. It just so happens the kids enjoyed them too. You stupid."
I need to make one thing clear. There is nothing inherently wrong with a piece of media directly targeting a young audience. It's not like kids can't handle stories with dark themes and complex storytelling. Comics may have been aimed at a young demographic, but that didn't stop them from exploring themes of drug addiction, racial commentary, torture, death, and insanity. Just because some stories were aimed at a young audience doesn't mean that they were childish or toned down. Some of the most popular and mature stories nowadays are stories that again were created for a young demographic. However, just because a story targets a young audience doesn't mean that other ages can't enjoy them too. There's a distinct difference between a story that was created for kids in mind and stories that only children would enjoy. Look at some of the adaptations for these works, such as Bruce Timm's Batman series and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. They are both adaptations of kids' characters, but they still contain scenes of disturbing imagery and visceral bone-crunching beatdowns. It's safe to say that comic books, specifically those of the Marvel and DC variety, are stories that were intended for a specific audience, but ended up being enjoyed by all. So how do you translate a medium with a sheer variety of fans and convert it into a film that everyone can watch? Well, that's where the rating system comes in. Most movies today fit the criteria of PG-13, a rating that lets filmmakers translate most stories without much restrictions, but also allows a huge variety of audiences to view them as well. Now, The rating that seems to be gaining more popularity nowadays is the infamous R rating. Most rated R movies receive this rating for three specific reasons: the visceral violence, nudity, and profanity. The reason why a lot of fans love the rating so much is because they believe it makes movies more mature or complex. It's true that some R-rated superhero films are darker than most. Very few of them actually utilize their ratings to the fullest effect. Films like Logan, Deadpool, and Blade use their ratings to serve their story, characters, or world, while other R-rated movies simply use their ratings for aesthetical purposes. Let me ask you a question. If you made Hellboy and Birds of Prey PG-13, would it affect the film? That's right, it would virtually have no effect. Now let me ask you another question. If you were to make a film like Seven PG-13, would it affect the film in a significant way? Well, in this case, yes, as the R rating was used to tell a more effective and visceral story. The rating served the film instead of being used as a marketing ploy to get more people to see the film. In my opinion, an R rating has to be a result of the characters and the world they inhabit. Having an R rating doesn't suddenly make your film more complex or unique. Not if you don't utilize it properly. Most superhero films nowadays are PG-13 because they can effectively tell their stories, even with the restrictions the rating sets in place. Hell, some of the most darkest and complex films I've seen had PG-13 ratings. Films like Dunkirk, Cloverfield, Poltergeist, and The Dark Knight are all PG-13, but they effectively told their stories without feeling like their contents were toned down for a younger audience. So if superhero movies are capable of telling dark and complex stories with a PG-13 rating, is there any place for R-rated superhero films to begin with? Well, yes, there is, and there's three major reasons for why. 1. The ever-changing nature of the medium. 2. Deconstruction, and 3. The context of the world they're in. Comics are a flexible medium. There is never a case where characters and their world maintain the same tone and atmosphere throughout all their stories. It's the reason why characters like Batman can be campy and lighthearted in one iteration, but also become dark and brooding in other stories. This element of change is complemented by the fact that many characters can have stories that exist outside the main continuity. This allows writers to tell widely different and unique stories that lets them take risks, but also gives them the flexibility to make changes to a character's world, psychology, cast, and tone, all without affecting the mainline iterations of these characters. Now, when you think about it, superhero movies count as Elseworld stories. They exist outside the mainline continuity, and thus, creatives can take their own creative liberties with the world as long as they don't stray too far from the source material. Many stories like Watchmen, Miracle Man, and The Boys are deconstructions of the comic medium. Usually these stories exist in a much more grounded world in order to show the brutal truth of what would happen if heroes truly existed. These stories are usually dark reflections of a superhero story that serve to force the reader out of their idealized envisioning of a hero. When these works are adapted to film, it's essential that they have an R rating. There's no other way to faithfully translate these stories' contents onto the small and silver screen without it. A lot of R-rated superhero stories are set within grounded worlds. The purpose of this is to reveal how superheroes would actually be like if they existed in our reality. They don't go on fun adventures, and the world is no longer sugar-coated or fantasized. Instead, the heroes face real struggles, and their personal stakes are usually much higher. Films like Super use their grounded natures to reveal the sheer absurdity and impractical idea of superheroes in the real world. While works like Daredevil, The Crow, and The Punisher take a more visceral approach to their grounded worlds. They use their grounded nature to bring into light the darkness of the world we live in, and the heroes in these stories are typically morally ambiguous or on the brink of letting their angers consume them. Perhaps this is why many fans want Matt Reeves' The Batman to also have an R rating, since it's also a superhero story set within a gritty and grounded world, with a version of Batman that's clearly on the brink of a vengeful explosion. So is there a place for R-rated superhero films? Well, the simple answer is yes. as long as those type of films don't become oversaturated and the rating is used for the purpose of complementing the story and characters. Superhero movies are often awesome and crafted to perfection, with amazing stories that capture the mind of adults and kids alike. But we should always leave room for creatives to tell more darker and mature stories if they believe it'll fit the story.